Hey everybody, I am here. Hope you're up as well. Big day today from the Trump administration. I'm not going to talk a lot about that yet. This is mostly just I'm not getting into the daily news updates yet. But it was really great to see the God Emperor getting rid of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But potentially more significant was something that I heard him say on a news report when he said that companies that get rid of American workers who then set up factories abroad and then try to import the goods that they were manufacturing previously in the States, those companies are going to be subject to a pretty serious tariff. And so that's probably in the long run considerably more significant than the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the renegotiation or cancellation of NAFTA, depending on how that turns out. The other thing I want to mention, just for kicks, because I was excited about this, but I finally got my copy of the new edition of A Throne of Bones. Kind of a monster, 922 pages or so, but it's nice to actually get my own copy, so that's cool. Anyhow, so the alt-right, there's a lot of talk about it. Some of the folks on the alt-right are trying to keep their distance from it, which makes sense because of all the media pressure. Certainly, there have been a lot of debacles and so forth because of the whole first the thing with Mike Enoch getting doxxed and then turning out to have a relationship with a B'nai B'rith person or employee, and then what happened with Richard Spencer getting clocked a couple times on camera by some very apparently strange little man. But what I wanted to point out is that all of these things are meaningless distractions. What's important and what is significant about the alt-right is the ideas. It's not about the people. Somebody said, you should all be punched. Yeah, good luck with that. Anyhow, the thing is that to talk about the alt-right in terms of people or in terms of a movement or an ideology or anything like that, it makes no sense at all. It's like talking about socialism, okay? The correct answer when you talk about somebody being socialist or the socialist movement, there's many different types of socialism. There's Marxism, there's Fabian socialism, there's Gramsciism, and there's Marxist-Leninism, etc., etc. Okay, and so the alt-right is something similar to that, but it's even more amorphous because there are competing ideas. What the alt-right primarily indicates is that it is not the conservative right. It is not the neocon quasi-right. There is something fundamentally different between someone like me, even someone like Milo, someone like Cernovich, someone like Richard Spencer, someone like Steve Saylor. All of these people are very, very different than the somebody says many on the alt-right insist that National Socialism is part of the alt-right. Well, that's ridiculous because National Socialism is dead. That's like, you might as well talk about the Whig Party being an essential part of the alt-right. It doesn't make any sense in the fact that some people like to dress up and run around wearing armbands or something is no more meaningful than if everyone started wearing smiley face t-shirts. Okay? I mean, you need to understand there's a fundamental difference between ideas and people. And, that's why one of the first things that I did when I started looking into that, because I was a libertarian. That meant something. The ideas that went into the libertarian ideology were ideas that I was, by and large, in support of. Well, I had to give that up. I'm still a libertarian idealist. I still love the idea of liberty. I still seek liberty for myself and others. But I wrote the 16 points because I sat down and thought, okay, what distinguishes what I think from a conventional conservative or a conventional libertarian. And so that's why I wrote what is called the 16 points of the alt-right. And that's why it's been embraced, those 16 points have been embraced around the world. It's been translated into 21 languages. Tomorrow I am interviewing the head of a Israeli political party, and the party's name is Identity. And a very smart guy, very bright guy. And what was really interesting is that he is in many ways, his party in many ways could be quite reasonably described as alt-right from the perspective of the 16 points. Now, I don't know exactly because I'm not an expert on this party or their ideology or anything else, but the fact that a Israeli political party can reasonably be described as being akin to the alt-right fundamentally means the entire idea of alt-right equals the 60-year dead German political philosophy is absurd. It's absolutely ridiculous. And people want to, the media wants to simplify things and dumb things down. And you've got certain people, many of them obviously not very serious, and certainly not very intellectual, who are trying to claim that, it must mean X or it must mean Y or that sort of thing. And, this is not a corporate branding exercise. Okay, I know that people want to be the next Karl Rove, or they want to be the next sort of expert political commentator, branding, marketing, whatever. But that's absurd. I mean, all that stuff is totally irrelevant. And what I get interviewed, I get requests for interviews, and I refuse to do them on camera. I only do them via writing because I don't want to get involved in their little manipulative games. And when I send them, I got interviewed by the New York Times. It was actually by the reporter that Trump was accused of mocking. I got interviewed by Politico. I got interviewed by a number of other folks. And none of my questions, or none of the answers that I provided them to the questions that they asked, and keep in mind, I wasn't seeking these interviews. In fact, in one case, I actually kind of blew the guy off for a while. He kept pestering me. So finally I said, fine, I'll answer your questions. And they didn't run any of them, not a single one. And the reason is pretty simple. As somebody had commented, they said the media doesn't want to discuss this because this sounds far too intelligent and far too reasonable. Okay, and it is. In fact, I have gone so far as to say, when people say, well, why do you subscribe to the alt-right political philosophy or whatever? And the reason is very simple. It is the only one, current today, that actually describes current events. It's the only one that provides a successful predictive model for what has happened recently and what's going to be happening in the near future. And conservatism has failed. Neoconservatism has failed. Liberalism has failed. The triumphal end of history concept that Fukuyama was pitching about the inevitable triumph of secular democracy is a disaster. It's completely failed. And Huntington with his Clash of Civilizations was much more on point. And what we're gradually seeing develop in the alt-right, because remember, the alt-right doesn't mean Nazism, it doesn't mean white nationalism, it doesn't mean any of that crap. It means alternative right. That's what the term was originally coined to be, and people wanted to grab the term because they thought it was a cool sounding term and they wanted to make use of it. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Someone asked, could you give us an educated but simplified rundown of what the alt-right really encompasses? Now remember, this is just what I'm describing it means to me. And this is something that many people have agreed with. If you go to my blog, if you just type in 16 points alt-right on Google, or go to my blog at voxdata.blogspot.com, and you'll find what I lay out as the 16 points of the alt-right. And just so you understand, Richard Spencer has said that he agrees with most of it. many people across the alt-right, whether they're what I describe as more the alt-west, which is the sort of omni-nationalism, the omni-national approach, or whether it is more the sort of what I call the alt-white, which is more the focused on America and focused on white nationalism. Those are two variants of the one is the alt-white is just a subset of the alt-west, and it's not even purely Western. I mean, that's why we're seeing that's why it's translated into everything from Russia to Hebrew to Greek, because what it is more than anything else is omni-nationalism. The old nationalism, which conservatism has preserved a few, especially the paleo-conservative have preserved some parts of. That was a little bit imperialistic, okay? And this is another huge difference, and another way that the alt-right has nothing to do with historical Nazism, because the whole idea of imperialism is anathema to the alt-right, because we understand that imperialism has been bad for the nations. Someone says, you say that's what it means to you, how is this any different than 40 different... That's the way that ideas work, okay? I mean, if you want to be perfectly technical, you can say there is no such thing as alt-right. There is no such thing as neoconservatism. Neoconservatism didn't mean anything until Urban Crystal, I think it was, defined it, and then people came to accept that, all right? That's a process. Conservatism, it means something very, very different in the British sense than it does in the American sense. And in fact, the guy who defined American conservatism actually said it's not an ideology. And if you read his 10 points, you can see that it's essentially just an attitude and a defensive posture. And so, conservatism was never ever going to be a successful ideology, because it was basically just a reactive attitude. And so, now, is it subjective? Yes, all intellectual concepts are subjective until they are so broadly accepted that the term becomes objective. And so that's a process that's going to play out, for what we call the alt-right. Excuse me, I got a cough. That's a process that's going to play out for the alt-right over the next 20 to 30 years. We are not going to settle exactly what the alt-right is, and we may end up coming up with a different name for it. It may end up becoming be called Trumpism, or it may be called something else altogether. Before the alt-right term sort of became to dominate it, I was actually thinking it was more as like mill-right or hard-right or whatever. But alt-right is actually a better term, because it is fundamentally, first and foremost, an alternative to the right-wing political philosophy that has dominated the United States, and to a lesser extent the West, throughout, for the past 100 years or so. And so, yeah, somebody said, as the ideas of the alt-right get more exposure and become more commonly adopted, an orthodoxy will develop. But we're at the very, very early stages. There is no orthodoxy now. Greg Johnson or Richard Spencer or myself or anyone else, we can make whatever grand pronouncements we want, but it doesn't matter. History will decide what sticks. People will decide what the terms mean. And so all we can do is describe these things to the best of our ability. And so, for me, it doesn't really matter. I'm not concerned about the brand. I'm not concerned about what the media says. The more the media tries to call someone like me a Nazi, the less credibility they have, because they cannot do that and quote my words at the same time. It's not possible. And so they can't they can't do and that's why it's a mistake to worry about the media coverage, to dance for the media, or to fear the media. The important thing is to just continue to speak the truth, because people will come to recognize the truth. People will come to recognize the lies, Just Donald Trump has done a phenomenal job of cutting through the media bullshit simply by continuing to speak what he sees to be the truth. And that's what we need to do too. One of the most important things that Donald Trump said in his inaugural address was to not be governed by fear. And that applies to us in the alt-right, it applies to Americans, it applies to everyone across the West. Because what has driven the success of the globalists, what has driven the success of those who have created this huge, horrible edifice that is everything that we in the alt-right are opposed to, they have done that mostly because conservatism is ruled by a spirit of defeatism and fear. And so, my thoughts on purity spirals and alt-right infighting. I think it's totally pointless, and there's no reason for it. I just see no point in it. How do we uncuck Christianity? Again, by speaking the truth and by speaking it without fear and confronting the people who are lying about it. In my book Conservative, I've got a whole chapter talking about the utter biblical, or the utter non-biblical nature of the verses that the cucks refer to, and there's all kinds of different verses that specifically point out the opposite. So, a Dune quote. Yeah, fear is the mind killer, the little death. So anyhow, excuse me. So that's my point. Don't worry about the branding. Don't worry about the media. Look up the 16 points. If those are things that you agree with, then you are alt-right, whether you call yourself that or not. Okay? If you believe in the government ownership of the means of production, you're a communist, whether you realize it or not. Okay? The ideas matter. The opinions, the brand, the marketing, all that stuff is spin that's meant to influence people. I don't care about that stuff. It's not of any interest to me whatsoever. And there's an appropriate place for politics. There is it's an important aspect of the polite conflict by which societies are governed, but that is not the complete focus, and it should not be the complete focus of those of us who are simply trying to sort out what is true from what is not. Obviously, because I'm more interested in philosophy, but and there's overlap with economics and with politics. That's why my book SJWs Always Lies and Conservative are both considered political philosophy, but they're not politics per se. They're just as useful. For anyone who is, regardless of what political views or prospects they have. So let's do two questions. First of all, if we're anti-imperial, how do we avoid ceding hegemony to China? That's a good question. I don't know. The Chinese situation is huge and vast. All I can say is that it's very smart to avoid getting into wars with major regional powers, especially over nothing and more than anything over allies. Look at the map sometime, though, from a Chinese perspective. You can see why they're troubled. They're basically pinned in by a series of American bases stretching from Japan to the Philippines. And so what I would recommend is simply letting China know that America is going to be operating in its national interest first, rather than trying to rule the world as the global police. And I don't think that China's going to be too much of a problem, because they've got their own issues, and their main interest in expanding is into Africa. So, and that's where things could get a little dicey. One more question. Who's got one more question for me? Can you point us to reference materials on those predictive models and science of the alt-right? Well, there is no science of the alt-right. There's just predictive models. But what I would recommend doing is, if you go to my blog, there's a tag that says alt-right. If you click on it, all the posts that are related to it will be there. And judge for yourself. I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. So, Look, you guys need to learn. Some of you need to learn that just saying, what evidence is there? All that means is you're ignorant, okay? If you want to look up what evidence there is that China is involved in Africa, why don't you look up the Chinese African corporations? They have massive, massive installations and huge numbers of colonists. They were actually planning on putting over 1 million colonists. They had a plan, I think, recently to put over 1 million colonists in Africa. So, anyhow, well, that's all I've got time for tonight. So, thanks very much. And in terms of what's the best way to introduce people to the alt-right, then I would say go to voxday.blogspot.com. Read the 16 points in whatever language you're most comfortable with, and have a look at it. So, thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.